For decades, Wall Street analysts, aggressive hedge fund managers, and arrogant corporate raiders committed the exact same fatal error when looking at Berkshire Hathaway. They looked at the folksy charm, the grandfatherly demeanor, the cherry cola, the ukulele playing, and the quaint annual meetings in a massive arena in Nebraska, and they saw a relic of a bygone era. They saw a harmless, outdated investor who simply picked good stocks, offered folksy Midwestern wisdom, and held them forever. They believed the incredibly cultivated public relations narrative that he was simply a benevolent uncle of American capitalism, a man completely detached from the cutthroat, bloodthirsty mechanics of modern finance. But underneath that carefully cultivated, benevolent exterior lay an absolute apex predator, a financial leviathan operating with a level of cold, calculating violence that left entire industries hollowed out in its wake. The catastrophic dismantling of the American textile industry, the merciless strangulation of rival insurance firms who found themselves utterly unable to compete against an endless, suffocating fortress of capital, the hostile absorptions of desperate utility companies during market collapses, and the silent, creeping, monopolistic domination of the transportation sector. These were not just business transactions. They were systematic executions. They waited in the shadows while aggressive competitors over-leveraged themselves in periods of manic euphoria, and when the inevitable economic winter arrived, they struck with ruthless, merciless efficiency, feasting on the decaying corpses of the over-ambitious and the financially reckless. Any other traditional holding company would have fractured under its own immense gravity decades ago. Any other sprawling conglomerate would have been torn apart by aggressive activist investors demanding immediate returns, liquidated into specialized spin-offs, or simply faded into the footnotes of history during the explosive dot-com bubble or the 2008 financial apocalypse. In the modern era, holding companies suffer from what analysts call the conglomerate discount. They should have been rendered obsolete by high-frequency trading algorithms, by the hyper-aggressive venture capitalists of Silicon Valley, or by the sheer mathematical impossibility of compounding massive wealth indefinitely across dozens of entirely unrelated industrial sectors. But instead of vanishing into the corporate abyss, they did the unthinkable. They weaponized patience. They transformed the sheer emotion of the market, the manic greed of the booms, and the blinding, irrational panic of the crashes, into a mechanical, unstoppable acquisition engine. They did not just survive economic disasters, they actively relied on them. They orchestrated their absolute greatest triumphs in the darkest, most terrifying hours of global capitalism, using the destruction of others as the very fuel for their own unprecedented expansion. This is the story of how Warren Buffett invented the ultimate capitalist black hole, turned the seemingly innocent concept of an economic moat into a ruthless war of attrition, and learned how to deliberately starve competitors of capital in order to ultimately win eternity. To understand the sheer, absolute depth of this corporate empire, we must rewind time far back to its true origins. The public relations myth is romantic, almost mythological. A brilliant, humble man sitting in a modest office, reading thick annual reports, magically identifying undervalued gems, and gently riding them to enormous prosperity alongside everyday investors. This is a profound, monumental historical illusion. The true origin of this empire is forged in vengeance, predatory calculation, and brutal corporate bloodletting. Berkshire Hathaway was not a glorious financial vehicle. It was a failing, decaying textile mill in New Bedford, Massachusetts. In 1964, the desperate management of that dying mill tried to shortchange this young, aggressive investor by 1/8 of a point on a tender offer for his shares. It was a petty, insignificant insult, but the response was an absolute declaration of holy war. He bought the entire company, taking majority control not because it was a thriving business, but out of pure, concentrated spite to fire the executive who had crossed him. And then he performed the ultimate act of corporate cannibalism. He mercilessly drained the cash flows from the dying textile operations, squeezing every last drop of equity out of the deteriorating factories and the laboring workforce to fund his first insurance acquisitions. He completely sacrificed the original host to birth a financial leviathan, leaving the textile workers behind as he ascended to the elite echelons of finance. Their ultimate weapon was something entirely invisible: float. While mortal competitors had to beg investment banks for expensive loans, issue incredibly risky high-yield bonds, or dilute their own shareholders to raise capital for expansion, this entity discovered a profound, incredibly lucrative legal loophole in the very fabric of the financial universe. By aggressively acquiring insurance companies like National Indemnity and later taking absolute control of Geico, they collected billions of dollars in premiums up front, money that technically did not belong to them, but which they could hold and invest for years, sometimes decades, before catastrophic claims ever had to be paid. This was the float. It was essentially an infinite, interest-free loan from the American public. They weaponized this float to buy massive, untouchable monopolies, while rival firms were suffocating under the crushing weight of debt and sky-high interest rates during brutal economic downturns. This empire was always armed with billions in free cash, ready to deploy at exactly the moment when targets were most vulnerable, terrified, and desperate. It was a structural advantage so profoundly unfair that it functioned like a permanent cheat code for capitalist reality. And it led to an unprecedented golden era of expansion. The sheer scale of their subsequent conquests defied all mortal comprehension. They bought the Burlington Northern Santa Fe Railroad, effectively monopolizing the physical arteries of American commerce and ensuring that a vast percentage of everything moved across the continent paid them a toll. They swallowed massive, sprawling energy grids. They accumulated controlling, unassailable stakes in the most addictive and ubiquitous products on Earth, from the sugary dominance of Coca-Cola to the inescapable technological ecosystem of Apple. They sat on over $160 billion in pure, unadulterated cash, a war chest so massive it rivaled the gross domestic product of entire sovereign nations. The corporate world entirely bowed before them. They were no longer just a company. They had become the de facto central bank of American capitalism. The hubris of total dominance was absolutely intoxicating. But the higher the incredible ascent, the more devastating the inevitable fall. And the falls were agonizing, deeply humiliating, and incredibly expensive. The corporate apocalypse did not come from a brilliant new competitor. It came from their own arrogant, hubristic miscalculations. In 1993, they purchased Dexter Shoe Company, entirely convinced of its enduring brand power and their own infallible judgment. But they paid for it, using their own immensely valuable Berkshire stock, a catastrophic, unforced error that ultimately cost them over $8 billion in lost future value as ruthless foreign competition utterly slaughtered the domestic shoe industry. rendering Dexter completely worthless. Then came the agonizing, excruciating years of the late 1990s, when the explosive technology boom made their old economy portfolio of bricks, paint, and candy look incredibly foolish. The financial media openly mocked the oracle, boldly declaring that the new digital world had moved too fast for his archaic analog methods. Years later, there was the humiliating disaster with Kraft Heinz, where partnering with a ruthless private equity firm destroyed the very soul and brand equity of beloved products through aggressive cost-cutting, leading to a catastrophic $15 billion write-down. And during the 2020 pandemic, the brutal, terrifying losses in the airline sector forced them to dump massive, multi-billion-dollar holdings at the absolute desperate bottom of the market. There were prolonged, terrifying moments when it seemed like the definitive end. It seemed the magic had finally, completely evaporated, that the sheer, bloated size of the beast made it impossible to maneuver, and that they would slowly, agonizingly bleed out in a rapidly digitizing, hyper-connected world. Yet, here lies the grand corporate plot twist. Every single time the market prepared to read their final eulogy, a devastating global catastrophe occurred. The euphoric tech bubble spectacularly, violently burst. The 2008 subprime mortgage crisis tore the global financial system to absolute shreds, bringing the world to the brink of total collapse. And while the arrogant visionary bankers who had mocked them were suddenly begging for massive government bailouts, facing catastrophic margin calls, or marching toward total liquidation, this empire descended from the sky like a financial grim reaper. They offered predatory, punishing lifelines to desperate, crumbling titans like Goldman Sachs and General Electric. But these were absolutely not acts of charity. They were brutal extractions of flesh. They demanded massive amounts of preferred stock, yielding extortionate, double-digit interest rates and lucrative warrants that guaranteed them massive upside when the panic inevitably subsided. They literally digested the sheer panic of the global economy, absorbing the bleeding life force of their desperate rivals to make their own fortress even more impenetrable. Fast forward to the modern era, and the battlefield has fundamentally, radically shifted. Prolonged periods of zero interest rate policies, the explosive rise of aggressive sovereign wealth funds, antitrust regulators circling like vultures over every major acquisition, and the terrifying, unpredictable acceleration of artificial intelligence all threaten to finally, permanently dismantle their slow, methodical approach to commerce. The modern world demanded extreme agility, but they were a colossal, slow-moving behemoth. Yet they executed another radical, unthinkable pivot. They silently broke their own oldest, most sacred rules, absorbing a gargantuan, defining stake in the ultimate technology monopoly, Apple, entirely turning a hardware and software company into the absolute cornerstone of their supposedly analog portfolio. They aggressively consolidated energy infrastructure, positioning themselves as unavoidable gatekeepers to the future of the power grid. They amassed a cash fortress of nearly $300 billion, sitting in wait while the market reached new, terrifying heights of euphoria. This was not just a corporate whim or a lucky guess. It was a profound, aggressive statement to the world. We are not a relic of the past. We are a modern superpower, and you will reckon with us. They forged the ultimate corporate mechanism for permanent survival, a decentralized, completely emotionless machine that does not innovate, does not invent, and does not create. It simply waits, It accumulates, and it ruthlessly conquers. We are left looking at two entirely irreconcilable visions of this empire. On one hand, it is a dystopian, monopolistic, wealth-hoarding mechanism, a sprawling, bureaucratic monster that starves true innovation by locking up hundreds of billions of dollars in passive capital, profiting enormously off the addiction to sugar, the absolute dependence on fossil fuels, and the forced necessity of insurance. On the other hand, it is the ultimate, undeniable masterpiece of rational capital allocation, an indispensable pillar of economic stability that provides a safe harbor for millions of pensions and retail investors, a towering testament to the raw, undeniable power of compounding logic over manic, destructive emotion. Because sometimes, hidden behind the simple logo of Berkshire Hathaway, there is a quiet, invisible war, a war between the hostile raiders they were in the past, the untouchable monopoly they are today, and how the world desperately wants to see them